What's up, bozos? This is Office Hours with the Professor, the show that's proudly irrelevant. In today's video, I'm going to talk about the European Mesolithic, a transitional period of several thousand years between the last glacial period and the introduction of agriculture. Originally, now, my plan was to briefly touch on the Mesolithic before moving on to Europe's first farmers, but it's worth it to spend more time on this period, not only for its own sake, but also to establish context. The story picks up 11,000 years ago, or as I like to say, KYA, kya. 11 kya, 3,000 years after my last series, Cavemen Rock, concluded. And we finished with the world's oldest known breadcrumbs found in Jordan, and incredibly, the most recent known archaic hominins, known as the Red Deer Cave people, whose remains were found in southwest China. By 11,500 years ago, Homo sapiens was the last hominin, asterisk, standing, and the last gasp of the Ice Age, double asterisk, known as the Younger Dryas, had concluded. By this time also, the ancient megafauna, such as cave bears and woolly mammoths, had gone extinct. In geological terms, the Pleistocene epoch had ended, and the Quaternary had begun. In anthropological terms, the Paleolithic was over, and mankind now entered the Mesolithic era. Now, what do I mean by Paleolithic and Mesolithic? The Paleolithic, or the Old Stone Age, was characterized by very small band societies, or foraging cultures of no more than 50 people. That's a band society, spread over huge territories. And another important characteristic of the Paleolithic was that during this time, we shared the planet with species now extinct. Archaic hominins, for one thing, and Pleistocene megafauna for another. In the Mesolithic, or in the Middle Stone Age, modern humans are the planet's only hominins that we currently know of. The megafauna have gone extinct, and societies can, on occasion, be slightly larger and more complex, for example, with the very first permanent structures being built. One professor of mine characterized the Mesolithic by small game hunting, in the sense that moose are smaller than mammoths. If you like to think of the Paleolithic as big game hunting, and I do mean big, the Mesolithic is comparatively small game hunting. Now, some Mesolithic people also did cool stuff like clay pottery, controlling wild grains, controlling which plants grew where, when, things like that. They were still, however, essentially hunter-gatherers, and that is the key quality that sets the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic apart from the Neolithic, or the New Stone Age. In much of the world, the Mesolithic was a transitional period of several thousand years, although in a few areas it could be argued to have continued into the 20th century even. Due to this in-between nature of the Mesolithic, I've struggled with where these guys fall on the caveman-barbarian dichotomy. In the end, I think I've decided that they're closer to cavemen, since they're hunter-gatherers, and for bonus points are, in fact, occasionally found in caves. Any Mesolithic time travelers who think otherwise are free to disagree. So, let's go ahead now and take a look at the Europe of 11,000 years ago. The first thing that you'll notice is the extended coastlines, most saliently in the huge plain land that is now covered by the North Sea. This huge area, which many thousands of people must have called home over the millennia, is now known as Doggerland, or as I call it, Snooperland.
depths of the sea. Back to the block, Snoop Doggy Dogg, funky, yes, the doc went solo on that ass, but it's still the same. Long Beach is the spot where I serve my cane. Follow me, but don't lose your grip. 9 trizzies, the years there for me to fuck up shit. So I ain't holding nothing back, and motherfucker, I got 5 on the 20 sack.
As the glaciers receded at the end of the Ice Age, people were able to expand into the northern parts of Europe, such as Britain, Scandinavia, and yes, Long Beach. I mean, Snooperland. For thousands of years, prehistoric OGs called this region home. Their cultures now vanished beneath the waves of the North Sea, awaiting a day now not far off, when advances in underwater archaeology will reveal their secrets to us once more. Who were the people living in this lost world? Well, let me introduce you first to Cheddar Man, who ironically was lactose intolerant.
One, two, 3 into the 4. Snoop Doggy Dogg and Dr. Dre is at the door, ready to make an entrance, so back on up.
Cause you know we're about to rip shit up.
Give me the microphone first so I can bust like a bubble. Compton and Long Beach together, now you know you in trouble. Ain't nothing but a G thing, baby. 2 loped out niggas, so we're crazy.
Now, Cheddar Man's remains were excavated, unsurprisingly, in Cheddar, which is in Somerset in England, and more specifically in Gough's Cave, which appears to have been a busy place during the late Paleolithic and Mesolithic. 14,000 years ago, there was a culture known as the Magdalenian, which was spread across Western Europe and known best for the spectacular Lascaux cave paintings. Okay, maybe you've heard of those, and I'm sure I mispronounced it. Sorry, France. Meanwhile, Gough's Cave has a considerably more sinister reputation. A group of Magdalenian people, again, 14,000 years ago, were cannibalized here and had their skulls turned into drinking cups. And I know it sounds terrible, but remember, it's possible that this could have been their way of honoring their passed-on family members, or that it was an isolated incident that would have been viewed with the same horror that we see it nowadays. Or it could have been that murder and cannibalism were in some way ritualized or institutionalized to them. And I know it's disgusting. I'm sorry. But get used to it, there will be a lot of that kind of stuff in this series. At any rate, I'm struck by the juxtaposition of some of humanity's most beautiful and enduring arts coming out of the same culture that chopped people up, ate them, and drank from their skulls. And before we dismiss people of their time as inherently beneath us, consider the Nazis or the Khmer Rouge. Humans are fallen creatures and capable of monstrous evil. 4,000 years after these Magdalenians met their grisly end, Cheddar Man's body ended up in the same cave, and we're not sure if he was placed there or if that's where he died. There are no grave goods to indicate funerary ritual. Now, 85% of his genetic makeup is consistent with earlier populations who migrated from the Near East into the Alps and thence to Northern Europe, while only 15% of his ancestry is Magdalenian. This could suggest that the Magdalenians had dwindled in numbers by the time the Alpine group arrived, perhaps as the result of the millennium-long cold snap of the Younger Dryas, or that they were displaced by the newcomers. The migration could have been spurred by the end of the Younger Dryas, allowing expansion into the northern reaches of Europe, such as Britain and, yes, Doggerland. Cheddar Man, therefore, gives us just a glimpse into the demographic makeup of northwestern Europe at that time, and he may well have set foot himself on Doggerlandic soil. Not that he thought of it in that way. To his people, Doggerland would likely simply be considered the lowlands and Britain to be the highlands. Now, before I move on, I'd like to briefly point out that amazingly there exists genetic continuity between Cheddar Man and modern people still in the area. There's a history teacher of all jobs living half a mile from Gough's Cave who shares maternal ancestry with Cheddar Man.
With so much drama in the LBC, it's kinda hard being Snoop D-O double G. But I somehow, someway, keep coming up with funky ass shit like every single day. May I kick a little something for the G's?
They even have the same nose. Would you look at that? Now, while not a direct descendant, as is sometimes breathlessly reported by a media perpetually clueless on specialist topics, the local teacher could be thought of as Cheddar Man's great great nephew or cousin, many times removed. Given the often critical relationship between family and land in small scale hunter gatherer cultures, I think that Cheddar Man would likely be very happy to hear that his family was still in the area. Boy, oh boy, where did I get the bright idea to wear a tweed jacket in July? Burning up, dude. Alright, cheers! Okay. So now we've been introduced to one Mesolithic European, so let's learn a little now about what his life was like. So deer, oryx, and fish were important to the diet, as were caribou, traditionally called reindeer in Eurasia. I prefer to call them caribou, not only to emphasize that they were not domesticated, but also to highlight some similarities between Mesolithic Europe and traditional Alaskan cultures. Like traditional Alaskans, Mesolithic Europeans lived in small, seasonally nomadic groups in the interior, dependent on big game and seasonal fishing, while on the coast, larger semi-sedentary populations would have been feasible, sustained by fishing and marine mammal hunting. While interior populations did likely nomadize to fixed locations based on the season, they were nowhere near as mobile as their wide-ranging Paleolithic ancestors, which is another similarity with Alaska. Now, Alaskans, of course, are big on berries, especially blueberries, and I suppose that Mesolithic Europeans would have been as well. I love the idea of Doggerlanders gathering blueberries with the berry forks, or setting up caribou fences, or preparing to meet the annual migrations, or welcoming seasonal salmon runs to the river, just as their contemporaries in Alaska were doing and would continue to do until modern times. I think a traditional native interior Alaskan hunter and a Doggerlander would have a lot to talk about, especially in terms of hunting, processing, and butchering caribou and moose. I must note, however, that the diet in Mesolithic Europe included things unavailable in Alaska, like oryx and wild horse. We know that Mesolithic Europeans enjoyed roasted hazelnuts, having found piles of them in Mesolithic fire pits. I must think also that pine nuts would have been popular, which are an iconic Ket snack to this day. Now, the hunting and gathering cultures of pre-contact Alaska reached surprisingly large population sizes, especially along coasts and rivers, to the point where storytellers in modern times often make asides about how many people there were back then. Groups could have numbered into the hundreds, especially at periodic gatherings. So it's likewise possible that similar, larger, possibly semi-sedentary communities, nevertheless sustained by hunting and gathering, flourished in the rich environment of Western Europe, especially Doggerland. So, given the very low elevation of Doggerland, it would have been a fairly wet place in the summertime. Given also the heavy forest cover, people got around on rivers and creeks using dugout canoes. One of these vessels, known as the Pessie canoe, was found in Holland in 1955.
We gon' smoke an ounce to this. G's up, hoes down, while you motherfuckers bounce to this. Rolling down the street, smoking and out, sipping on gin and gills. Laid back.
With my mind on my money and my money on my mind.
Although we have no idea what kind of languages these people spoke, they could have formed a dialect continuum stretching from Central Europe to Britain with its origins in Alpine Europe. I say this because of the lack of natural barriers in the region, because of the apparent cultural and genetic continuity of the people, and because a similar phenomenon has occurred throughout boreal North America with the Dene or Athabascan languages forming a continuum stretching from southern British Columbia all the way almost to Washington state to interior Alaska. Of these people's cultural and spiritual lives, we know little. One interesting glimpse can be caught on the island of Teviec in Brittany, and again, I'm sorry for the pronunciation, where two women were buried richly adorned with beads under a canopy of deer antlers, having apparently died violent deaths. Perhaps they were killed in a raid from a rival tribe, and their grieving families sent them off in style. At the 11,000-year-old Star Car site in Yorkshire, an apparent headdress made from a deer skull has been recovered. It may have been used as part of a hunting disguise for ritual purposes, or quite possibly both. We also have a pendant marked to amazing detail, apparently in multiple phases and potentially by different people. It was then deposited at the shore of a lake, as was the deer headdress.
Now we got some new Snoop Doggy Dogg for that ass. This one is called The Shiznit. You're about to go downtown, bitch, right here on the station that plays only platinum hits. That's 187.4 on your FM dial. If you're licking, that's W Balls.
Everybody's got to hear the shit on W Balls, W Balls, W Balls.
So here, note the lake. We see an early example of late prehistoric Europeans' fascination with bogs, marshes, shores, islands, lakes, any place where land and water meet and mingle. We see the same phenomenon with the star car, pendant, and deer headdress. Shores, marshes, and islands were probably seen as the meeting point of two worlds, the material and spiritual, the living and dead, the profane and sacred. In peat bogs, especially, we've dug up everything from Mesolithic tools to mummified Iron Age bodies. Consider also the Viking ship funerals, or how Beowulf swam down into the lake to kill Grendel's mother. Europeans found spiritual significance in the meeting of land and water from the early Mesolithic all through the Age of Barbarians. This significance petered out of practice only with the spread of Christianity, and indeed remained embedded in folklore down to the present day. This is the kind of thing I mean when I reference the striking cultural continuity that existed over a period of many thousands of years. Now, as an aside, in Christianity, we also see the ritual of baptism. However, that had more probably to do with the ancient Mesopotamian ritual of the Apsu and Enki coming up out of the water to give civilization to the people. And who's to say that at the level of tens of thousands of years, they might not come from the same source. But anyway, if anyone was thinking about baptism, it's not exactly the same source. It was during the Mesolithic also that we see the first attestations of late prehistoric Europeans' fascination with astronomy. At Warren Field, Aberdeenshire, we've found a series of pits, possibly for bonfires or wooden posts, aligning to the solar and lunar calendars. Meanwhile, the first pine wood posts were raised for reasons obscure to us, at what would become the site of Stonehenge. Europe would have been divided by language, genetics, and culture into Western and Eastern groups. Mediterranean Europeans were culturally distinct, if genetically related to Westerners. Now that we've talked about Western Europe, let's see what was going on at the same time in Eastern and Mediterranean Europe. So again, Europeans at this time were split into two major genetic groupings, known as the Western hunter-gatherers and Eastern hunter-gatherers, with merging in Scandinavia and a divide around the modern Polish-Belarusian border. On Europe's far eastern frontier in the Ural Mountains, a humanoid sculpture has been recovered and dated to about the very beginning of the Mesolithic. Known as the Shigir idol, it is notable for its heights between 9 and 17 feet and the intricate carvings along its length.
Stopping, hopping like a rabbit. When I take the Nino Ross, you know I got to have it. I lay back in the cut, retain myself. Think about the shit and I think it well. How can I mix my grip? And how should I make that nigga straight slip? Set trip, gotta get him for his grip as I dip around the corner. Now I'm on another mission, wishing upon a star. Snoop Doggy Dogg with the caviar.
The idol was found deposited, apparently intentionally, in a peat bog, because of course it was. Even on the other side of Europe, they had a religious fascination with swamps and shores. Of course, we have no idea what significance the idol had to its creators, other than that they spent a good amount of time making it, only for it later to end up thrown into a bog. Really interesting. Further south, on the Pontic and Caspian steppes, we're seeing a highly mobile hunter-gatherer lifestyle, likely fueled by wild horse, oryx, and sheep, that would, in thousands of years, eventually develop into pastoralism and transhumance. Semi-pastoralism, that is. In this area, the eastern hunter-gatherers intermarried with groups in the Caucasus to the south. By the Neolithic, they would form a distinct population. Now, it's possible that some of these people spoke a language distantly ancestral to Proto-Indo-European. So, if we were to meet and speak to these people, we might even recognize a few of their words. Crossing over the Alps now into southern Europe, we find some interesting rock art depicting people and their lives that is absent from northern Europe at the same time. Although Mediterranean and Western Europeans at the time were genetically and therefore perhaps linguistically related, their cultural practices differ in important ways. Firstly, as I mentioned, rock art is much less prevalent from this period north of the Alps, especially depicting people. Secondly, south of the Alps, we don't see the same fascination with water and land boundaries, although this could simply be due to the much drier Mediterranean climate. Mesolithic anthropomorphic rock art is attested from North Africa, which suggests a degree of cultural exchange or continuity with Mediterranean Europe. Again, despite the genetic and potentially linguistic continuity across the Alps. Consider the similarity, at first glance anyway, between Iberian and North African rock art.
I'm somewhat brain boggled, so I'll look to the microphone and slowly start to wobble. Grab it, have it, stick it to the plug. Get Snoop, Doggy, I got a fat dub. Sack of the chronic in my back pocket low. Need myself a lighter so I can't take a smoke.
Can you tell the difference? I can't. This disparity between genetics held in common with Western Europe and culture held in common with North Africa is really striking, and I'm not sure how to explain it. Most likely, I'm putting too much stock in either or both of these elements, and the real situation was an organic spectrum of culture, genetics, and language, as human behavior generally is. Let's look at some specific examples of Mesolithic rock art from Mediterranean Europe. The Iberian Peninsula, in particular, is a treasure trove of the genre. Very importantly, in this period, we're seeing realistic depictions of people and their lives. Humans were much less common in Paleolithic rock art, and when they are present, they're done in a fantastic style, often with animal features depicting spirits and shamans. A great example is the sorcerer of, again, sorry for my French, Troy Frere, which is a Magdalenian work about 15,000 years old and therefore Paleolithic. Here he is.
The cloud becomes black and the sky becomes blue. Now you in the midst of the dog pound crew. Ain't no clue on why the fuck we do what we do. Leave you in the state of paranoia, ooh. Don't make a move for your gat so soon, cause I drop bombs like platoon.
Mesolithic art, by contrast, is a lot less trippy. It portrays people and their lives realistically, or more realistically. First of all, from about 8,000 years ago, let's look at this really charming piece from Cova de l'Aranya, Valencia, depicting the everyday activity of gathering honey. We also have Europe's first depiction of clothing, giving us a look at how people dressed at this time. This painting of people dancing comes to us from about 10,000 years ago at Roca dels Moros, and again, sorry for my Catalan, in Catalonia. Note the striped skirts for women and the guy with ornaments on his legs. We even see depictions of battle, something that has never shown up in the Paleolithic record. From 7.3 Kya, we have a depiction of combat between archers at Morella la Vella in Valencia. To me, it kind of looks like the guy in the middle is being ambushed by a group, although I suppose you could also make out two sides. Take a look.
Back in the days, on the side where it's at, a nigga had to have a fat stack, and I was a fool. Don't make me have to grab my strap and go rat-tat-tat-tat, nigga. Slap to a motherfucker face he fall. Can't none of y'all niggas see the doggy dog.
And the weirdest piece of the whole bunch I've saved for last. For this one, we'll need to go over to Sicily, where we find in Grotta della Daura a really bizarre scene. People have been arguing for decades over what exactly is happening here. Take a look.
I come down with the wickedness. One rude boy coming with the dopeness. Close your eyes cause you can't see me. I quit school cause of recess, you fucking BG. I'm shaking up the party like Lordy Dordy.
I have no idea myself, so I'll just describe what's in it. Here we have a circle of blobby-headed guys, fleshy-headed mutants, as the Mackenzie brothers might say. Or maybe they're just wearing hoods or masks. But the blobby guys are dancing in a circle around two more guys who appear to be tied up or contorted in some way, but are apparently very happy about it as they both have erections. And presiding over the scene with their arms raised are another two guys in bird masks, also with their junk out. And in the background, we have a red deer and some other people milling around, at least one of whom is female, with a backpack, and another of whom is in a bird mask. Another guy with a stick or a spear seems to be walking toward the main scene. And this engraving is between 11 and 13,000 years ago, and may have been made toward the very end of the Epic Gravettian culture, contemporaries and possible relatives of the Magdalenians. Given its age and cultural context, The engraving could arguably classify as very late Paleolithic, or I guess Paleolithic, right? Now, interestingly, if you look at the guys in the middle of the circle here, their dicks are drawn kind of similarly to the beaks on the Efficient's bird masks. Maybe that's just a coincidence, but maybe it isn't. Perhaps not coincidentally, just a couple thousand years prior to this, the Magdalenians at the famous Lascaux cave drew a bird-headed guy with his junk out, suggesting a Paleolithic cultural continuity.
Crazy monster world. It's a doggy dog world. It's a doggy dog world.
At any rate, given the coincidence of naked bird dudes between Grotta della Daura and Lascaux, there seems to have been a bird cult involving masks or simulated transformation into a bird that stretched at least from Sicily to France and lasted several thousand years across the Magdalenian and Epigravettian populations. Now, let's talk about some possibilities as to what in the crap is going on in the Grotta della Daura scene, starting from the tame and working up to the bizarre and macabre. First, there might be some kind of acrobatic game going on, probably with ceremonial overtones. Next, and I think this is the most probable, two new guys are getting initiated into the tribe. Of course, fraternity brothers have always made their pledges do ridiculous stunts for their amusement. Moving into the more shocking interpretations, there could be some kind of homoerotic activity happening here, but to my innocent and naive mind, that doesn't explain the guys being tied up, I think. Finally, it's been hypothesized that it's depicting a human sacrifice, because archaeologists love that crap, and of course they're going to interpret it that way. Then again, as we've seen at Gough's Cave, the Magdalenians did at least occasionally cannibalize people and drink from their skulls, so sacrificing a couple of dudes to the Ithyphallic bird god may not be completely out of character for their Epigravettian cousins. As for the red deer in the background, my thought is that it's there for the consumption at the post-initiation kegger. Although, I suppose feasting could happen after any of these possibilities. It could also be drawn in reference to what the ceremony was trying to accomplish, in a non sequitur kind of way. Or, to us, non sequitur. One cool thing about the Grotta della Daura engraving is that it really represents and encapsulates the transition from the Paleolithic to the Mesolithic. This piece comes to us from the very latest stages of the Paleolithic Epigravettian culture and may depict a Paleolithic bird cult tradition. At the same time, the engraving is definitely done in a human-centered, realistic style, clearly characteristic of later Mesolithic rock art. And its dating between 11 and 13,000 years ago is right at the moment of transition. I think we can really see here the interplay of new versus old ideas and ways of thinking that must have made this an extremely interesting and perhaps dangerous time to live. The Paleolithic Mesolithic transition must have been even more jarring with the extinction of megafauna and the climatic chaos of the Younger Dryas. So, as we've seen, Mesolithic Europe had two main cultural areas, overlapping with geography. The Mediterranean, where people depicted their lives through visual arts in a way never done before, and the moister forested area north of the Alps, where people deposited ritual offerings into swamps and lakes, seeing them as representing the physical spiritual boundary. Let's call the two groups painters and swampers. The cultural differentiation apparently did not overlap with genetics. Everybody from modern Poland westward belonged to what geneticists call the Western hunter-gatherers, descendants of the Magdalenian and Epigravettian populations. Although, as we've seen in the case of Cheddarman, we also had populations moving in from the Middle East. Western hunter-gatherers were therefore split between painters in the south and swampers in the north. In the eastern part of Europe, we see Eastern hunter-gatherers, who could well have been swampers if the Shigir idol is any indication. And remember, swamper and painter are cultural groups, not genetic groups.
Easy come, easy.
Yeah, gotta say what's up to my nigga Slick Rick. For those who don't like it, eat a dick. But for those who with me, sing that shit. Has it go a little something like this? Lordy Dotty, we likes to party. We don't cause trouble, we don't bother nobody. We're just some niggas who on the mic. And when we rock up on the mic, we rock the mic.
This brings me to the last part of today's episode, which speculates about language. I'm going to frame this as a response to a question from a fan in my last video, who says, I wonder whether you'll critically analyze some attempts at projecting certain languages and language groups on archaeological cultures. Many archaeologists I've seen try to shy away from that completely, or embrace it too wholeheartedly. And this is from Magnum Vorza. Well, Magnum, it's always tempting to conflate language, culture, and genetics, and it's often done very badly by people with ulterior motives, whether those are nationalistic or even racist, or simply because they support such and such a hypothesis and desperately want it to be correct. As is often the case, the dumbest people are the loudest, while the real experts are often quieter than they need to be, out of humility and understanding how little they really know. The truth is that whenever you conflate culture, language, and genetics, you're on extremely shaky ground. If somebody digs up my body in thousands of years and looks at my DNA, they might say, aha, this guy's from Central Europe and he either spoke German or a West Slavic language, which of course is completely wrong. If I died today and was buried in a Warsaw cemetery, they would dig me up and think that I was a hometown boy. An assumption reasonable, but incorrect. I'm an Anglophone from Colorado. People have always moved around, people have always been diverse, and people have always had cool family and individual histories that lead to surprising personal identities. I always think of how ethnic Russians are a recognized minority in mainland China. That means somewhere out there, there's a normal Chinese dude who's a Chinese citizen, born in China, whose first language is Chinese, but who happens to be white, blonde, and named something like Sergei Danilovich, who gets people calling, hello, Lao Wai, at him everywhere he goes. How frustrating that must be. On a very unfortunate note, linguists also have a hangover from some idiot back in the 30s who decided Aryan referred not to languages but to people, and not to Indo-Iranian speakers but to Germans. We all know how that turned out, even if it made as much sense as deciding that Icelanders were in fact Armenians. So, you can understand why serious linguists are hesitant to connect language to genetic, or worse, ethno-cultural or ethno-national populations. However, it's perfectly fine to look at evidence from different fields, and by viewing the situation from each of these lenses, kind of through the kaleidoscope, we can blend together a clearer picture of what really might have happened. Linguistics, archaeology, folklore, and genetics can aid and inform each other, and we're missing out if we only depend on one of these. Real experts are quite happy to do this. My great mentor and friend Ed Vida comes to mind, blending these fields of study to refine the Dene Yeniseian hypothesis. So, let's look at the non-linguistic facts and see what linguistic conjectures we can draw. We can also compare Mesolithic Europe to other parts of the world, for example, Alaska, New Guinea, and Australia, and suppose a similar linguistic situation with those areas. Mesolithic Europeans, as we say, were divided into two genetic groups, the Westerners and the Easterners. It was divided into two cultural zones, the Mediterranean painters and the northern swampers. The steppe hunters, way out at the edge of Europe, could arguably form a third genetic and/or cultural group if we consider them European, but for now, let's set them aside. The first possibility is that all of Europe was united into one huge language family. This would mean the genetically disparate Westerners and Easterners and the culturally disparate Swampers and Painters all spoke related languages. That the Shigir Idol people spoke a language related to the honey gatherers of Valencia. It would also mean that the previous late Paleolithic cultures, such as the Magdalenian and Epigravettian, spoke languages that derived from the same source, which in this scenario would probably be a language spoken by the early Aurignacian culture of 30 to 40,000 years ago. Aurignacian? Sorry. On this scale, regional differences would be so pronounced that they wouldn't seem like the same language family anyway, but rather several large clades that were for all intents and purposes their own language families, if possessing typological similarities. Bob Dixon, the eminent Australian linguist, proposes a similar scenario for Australia. While most of the continent is dominated by one language family, a more diverse tapestry of small families exists along the resource-rich North Australian coast. Dixon groups all of these together into a single family, having arrived on the continent with the first settlers of 60,000 years ago. Since so much time has passed since then, according to Dixon, they superficially appear to be different families. This is not the mainstream opinion, but I don't know enough about Australian linguistics to challenge him, and he is an expert. If in fact his hypothesis is correct, it seems reasonable to think the same thing could have happened in Europe. The second scenario is that there were several unrelated language families, perhaps spoken by Western Swampers, Easterners, and Painters, or by any combination of them.
It's the bow to the wild, creeping and crawling, Yiggy yes yo, and Snoop Doggy Dogg in the motherfucking house like every day. Dropping shit with my nigga Mr. Dr. Dre. Like I said, niggas can't fuck with this, and niggas can't fuck with that.
I doubt, I must say, that Easterners and Painters spoke related languages, since they were both genetically and culturally distinct populations. However, all Westerners, both Swampers and Painters, may have spoken related languages, as opposed to Easterners speaking languages of a different family. This would match the Paleolithic divide between Magdalenians and Epigravettians, to a degree. Or all Swampers, both Western and Eastern, could have spoken related languages, while Southern Painters spoke a language related to whatever was in North Africa, given their cultural similarities with that region. Language families could have also been divided between the coasts and interiors. In many parts of the world, for instance, Alaska, Australia, and the Pacific coast of North America, there's a lot more diversity along the resource-rich coasts, which can sustain higher populations, and are generally more desirable as a place to live. Doggerland, therefore, may have been a hotbed of linguistic diversity. This point about the coastal and interior peoples brings me to my third scenario, that there was one language family, probably across the interior of Europe, and many small families along the coasts and in refugia, such as Scandinavia and the Alps.
Shit that I drop, cause you know it don't stop. Mr. 187 on the motherfucking top. Tick tock, now with a Glock, just some nuts in the cock. Robbing motherfuckers, then I kill them blood cops. And I step through the fog and I creep through the small. Cause I'm Snoop Doggy, 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 oh.
My fourth and final scenario is the opposite of, but in some ways similar to, the first. That all of Europe was a patchwork of small, independent language families that would perhaps resemble New Guinea before the expansion of Trans New Guinea, Australia before the expansion of Papua-New-Guinea, or the Americas before the expansion of large families like Algonquian, Dene, and Arawakan.
Now just throw your hands in the motherfucking air and wave the motherfuckers like you just don't care, yeah.
Very much worth mentioning here is that the quote language family tree model may be entirely inappropriate for talking about languages in deep prehistory. A point made by Dixon in his excellent book, The Rise and Fall of Languages, is that the tree model representation of language families really only works for quickly expanding families like Indo-European. These are waves that suddenly rise and fall on the otherwise calm sea of linguistic diversity, wherein groups of languages will maintain a degree of equilibrium and internal mingling for long periods of time. He calls this the punctuated equilibrium model of language change. Consider how linguists have spent the last century beating their heads against walls, trying to come up with a consistent tree model for the Northern Dene languages, or what has frustratingly come to be known as Tibeto-Burman. It may simply be that the tree model is inappropriate for these long periods of linguistic stasis, and that it would be much more profitable to track these language areas by typological rather than genealogical relationships. This over-application of the tree model is what happens when you develop the science of classical linguistics from observations of Indo-European, Uralic, and Afroasiatic, three quickly expanding families, and then go out into the world and realize these families may in fact be exceptions to typical language behavior rather than the rule. Regardless, it is therefore deeply unwise to put any stock in the ramblings of any madman who claims to know anything about the languages of prehistoric Europe. Don't listen to me. I have no idea what I'm talking about. The only area that I feel any confidence talking about is the very southeastern corner of Europe, at the Pontic-Caspian steppe and into the forests of the Volga region, where a language ancestral or anciently parallel to Indo-European may have been spoken. Further north, it's not impossible that the guys who carved the Shigir idol may have spoken something ancestral or parallel to Uralic. It's not impossible. Going back to Dixon's point about typology, here we see that regardless of genealogical relationships, the area from Eastern Europe into the Ural region and the Western steppes probably had a typological zone that featured suffixing singular, dual, plural verb conjugations and noun declension. And that this area, the typology of this area, likely included case systems for their nouns. These features, which are documented in extant and reconstructed European languages, can't have popped up out of nowhere. They had to come from somewhere. That's about all I'll say for now, and even then, I want you to take this preceding paragraph here as, once again, the ramblings of a madman. I'm going to finish here before I embarrass myself further. Next time, we're going to discuss the arrival of the very first food producers in Europe between 8 and 10,000 years ago, and their tense coexistence with the local hunter-gatherers. To put it another way, the first barbarians face off with the last of the cavemen. Check it out. Hey guys, before I go, there's just one thing I wanted to share with you, something really special. I recently turned 34, and for my birthday, a friend of mine who knows that I'm into this stuff gave me something extremely special. So I am actually going to share with you a little piece of Mesolithic Europe. Let's take a look. So here we have a microlithic blade, stone blade, that was made between 10 and 12,000 years ago. And it was found in what is now Bavaria. Look at that shape. Isn't that beautiful? So here, holding it up to the light, you can see here the cutting edge on the blade. And 10 to 12,000 years ago, some person napped this tool and took this flake, and whoever made it was a wonderful expert. You can feel how well it fits between your right thumb and your forefinger, right here. It really even fits the curvature of your fingers. You have to think that's deliberate. And this groove here with the natural face of the stone fits right here into your third knuckle here. So it fits right in here, and whoever made this thing probably used it to scrape the meat from a bone or something like this. And actually, I have to think, I wonder if there's any residue on here still, Residue has been taken from stuff this old, and I wonder if this little red coloration on here is any kind of residue. Probably not. I'm just dreaming. It's a pretty special thing. You can see how the blade kind of sticks out here. You can also see, and this is going to be important later, you can see how there's this little point that sticks out. And it's really interesting that you can see here, there's a little point here, and it doesn't even look like it would be at all useful practically, but I don't think it was put there by accident, because I have another piece that you'll see later that has a similar design to it. So at any rate, here is my little piece of Mesolithic Europe that I'm going to treasure for the rest of my life. What a wonderful surprise to get this as a prize for outliving Jesus, I suppose, now that I'm 34. Well, anyway, at least in terms of mortal life, I understand he's still around, but I just wanted to share this really wonderful little piece of prehistory with you guys. So, everybody have a great rest of your day, and I'll talk to you in our next episode. Bye now.
It's the motherfucking Eagle Double G.
Snoop Dogg.
You know I'm mobbing with the D.R.E.
Yeah. You know who's back up in this motherfucker.